quote. And it shows. So before any further ado, let me introduce one of my favorite boyfriends. All right.
Oh, I love you. We won't talk about the ongoing affair.
Okay, we won't.
We won't. Thank you. It's really a delight to be back here, and I love coming here. I hope you'll excuse me tonight if I go a little less seamlessly, because I chose this place to be the first place, because I love it, the first place to give a talk about a book that hasn't even come out yet. It's brilliant, but it hasn't come out yet. And so for the first time in years, I'm going to be speaking from notes, probably. That's all right. I also would like to remind you, and I haven't used this opening line in maybe 4 years, but wherever I go around the country, I always give my speeches at night, and then I always ask them to put me in the schools during the day. And so they bring the whole school in, and I always get the same questions, what's it like to be an author? What's it like to be famous? And always, how old are you anyway, okay? So my wife, Carol, who I and all of us miss terribly, we're in Grand Rapids, Michigan, and there went all the hands up, and there was a little fourth grader. So up went her hand. I was getting all the same questions, and her hand, I said, yes, dear, what's your question? And she said, can you identify any recurring theme that runs throughout the body of your work? So I am challenging you at any time. This is a very informal topic, baseball. This is not going to change the world. So anytime you want to ask me a question, please do, because I would love to make this more about questions. The other housekeeping thing I have is that, thank God for this group of people, because I got quite a few emails once that brochure came out saying I was going to talk, asking me what am I writing now. So I am going to tell you, at the age of 45, on one side, I am writing 5 books. Can you believe? I finished up a book called Shipwrecks, and the book on shipwrecks is actually based on one sentence. I've never done that. I wrote a book based on one sentence I read. And that one sentence was, the vast ocean floor is the world's greatest museum. And I wish I had made that up, although I claim I do. But anyway, it's incredible what we are finding about this world and what has happened from ships that have laid there for 3,000 or 4,000 years. The baseball book is another book that I am writing and sort of waiting for the editor to send me all the stuff back. I am writing a book about a man who was the first white man. He was a photographer. And in the 1850s, he was the first white man to go into the West. No one had ever seen the West. The only ones who had, the only Native Americans who hadn't seen the West, were the fur trappers, and everybody knew how drunk they were. So they were, in their drunken language, sending back reports of these enormous mountains, of course, didn't exist, and geysers, stuff springing up, and chasms and canyons, and everybody knew that was a lot of baloney. And this guy went in and took photographs, and he was so good. His name is William Henry Jackson. He was so good that when Congress got a hold of the pictures, within 2 months they named Yellowstone the world's first national park. And then, because everybody loved those pictures so much, they named him the official photographer of the Transatlantic Railroad, Transcontinental Railroad. Didn't go across the ocean. And then, when the government sponsored the great 12 years of surveys into the West, he became the official photographer for that. I mean, it's an you couldn't make that story up. You really couldn't. Even I, who like to lie, could not make that story up. And then, toward the end of his life, not toward the end of what would be most people's lives, he lived to be 101. At 100, he was climbing the Rocky Mountains, taking photographs that he had originally taken. Toward the end of his life, he formed the Detroit Photographic Company, the world's first photographic publishing house. And it was the Detroit Publishing Company that made photography the most democratic and the most popular hobby in the world. He's an enormous man, and nobody ever heard of him. It's incredible. I'm also writing 2 other books in my spare time. The book that I have written that has sold the most copies over the years is called Resolute. And it was about the search for the Northwest Passage and the search of the world's greatest explorer and his 300 men who went missing. And there were like 88 searches for that. And I always thought when I wrote it that was a better book to do for young adults than for adults, because for adults you can't illustrate it the way you can, that you can for young adults. But secondly, the greatest explorer in the world goes missing. His 300 men are never heard from again. And for 28 years, it becomes the greatest maritime search in history, and they don't find nothing. 4 years ago, they found both ships. So it's another whole story to tell, and I'm pounced on it. And then the final book I'm writing. My son, Craig, who wrote the baseball book with me, has been bugging me for a year to write a book on a certain topic. And I said, "You're out of your mind. That's the dullest subject I've ever heard of in my life. That won't fly. Write the book." And every time he came to work on the baseball book, he bugged the hell out of me about, "Will you please write this book?" So finally I got so sick of it, hearing about it, that I said, "I'm going to tell you what. I will take 2 days, and I will go into research about those books, about that topic. And it's such a stupid topic that I will be able to prove to you how dumb that is." It's a great idea. It's just, would you believe, you're going to all laugh, it's about rainbows. And I said, who the hell wants to hear about rainbows? Well, first of all, just the scientific stuff I've read so far. If all of us went out there right now and there was a rainbow, no 2 of us would see the rainbow in the same way. Don't ask me why, I haven't read enough yet. But talk about having a book be beautiful. Every great artist and every not so great artist has done work with having rainbows in their art. Not just to make it pretty, because it means something to them. Having lost my wife recently, I understand why John Constable, his greatest painting of this incredible abbey, has an incredible image of a rainbow in it, because to him, the rainbow will counteract the incredible sadness he knows he's going to face for the rest of his life. So there's all that. But that's not why the darn book will sell like crazy. All of those are good reasons. Oh, and besides that, every culture in the world, I'm learning, every tribe, every nation, everything, has countless fables and myths about, including rainbows. Creation myths, anyway. But the reason that book will probably sell is because today there is not an LPGQT, I always get those numbers wrong and letters wrong. There's not one of those organizations that doesn't have a rainbow as its symbol of hope and pride and inspiration. So I'm answering the question. Those are the 5, and God knows what else I'll discover as I leave this place. But anyway, I'm very happy with this baseball book. I wrote it because I've been in love with baseball since birth. I wrote it also because I made it to AAA. I wrote it also because my son Craig and I have wanted to write a book together forever. But I've also wrote it because I also have experienced since a kid that the greatest newspaper writing, for example, the greatest columns have always been in the sports pages. The greatest writers, Red Smith and Robert Creamer and Red Barber and Bob Considine, the greatest of all the writers have always written, and I find as I do this research, as I did this research on the baseball book, that it's an extraordinary story. I mean, we had to come up with a topic, and that topic to me was always there, and it's that to do a book on 1941, because it was in 1941 that, to me, the most amazing feats, most amazing things took place. But it was also in 1941 that it all took place against the backdrop of a world going to war. So that it's just extraordinary. But I think mostly, let me just give you an example. See, I'm using notes. Let me give you an example. In 1941, one of the most amazing things, the two teams that played in the World Series in 1941 were the New York Yankees. Well, who the hell was surprised about that? They had played in 5 of the last 7 World Series, and they had scored 422 runs to 92 for somebody else. If the Yankees didn't make it, something was wrong. But they're playing against the Brooklyn Dodgers, who, in the previous 12 years, in an 8-team league, had finished next to last 10 times and had never played in a World Series. And they had some of the most inept players in the history of the game going into the 1940s. And I found this in my research that was extraordinary. Let me just read it to you. The poster boy of the Dodgers' ineptitude was outfielder Babe Herman, who, for reasons known only to him, carried a lit cigar in each of his pockets. He did. He's out in the outfield with a lit cigar in his pocket. A writer for Collier's magazine gave a vivid account of Herman's fielding abilities. It was an even bet, the writer stated, that Babe would either catch a fly ball or get killed by it. His general practice was to run up when the ball was hit, and then turn and run back, and then circle around uncertainly. All this time the ball was descending. The spectators were petrified with fear, and Mr. Herman was chewing gum unconcerned. At the proper moment, he stuck out his glove. If he found the ball there, he was greatly surprised and very happy. That's good writing. That's really good writing. And that's why I just knew that I should be doing this book. And I'll read you a couple other things as we go along to show you. It's an extraordinary year. American 1941 is an extraordinary year. A much different time than today. Computers were 50 years away from entering any household. There were no cell phones. There was no McDonald's, oh my God. There was no Burger King. Television did not exist except as an exotic new invention. The average price of a new car was $850. A gallon of gas cost 19 cents. That's American night. Baseball was very different too. Almost every game was played in the day. Almost no baseball team had, even New York, had night lights. There were only 9 teams in each league, none further west than St. Louis. There was no such thing as wild cards. It was completely unknown. There was no such thing as a shift, and there were no such thing as designated hitters. That's a very, very different game. There are a couple of things that all struck me as the best differences of all. One of them, you talk to your kids about this, they'll never believe you. When a half inning ended, the baseball players did not bring their gloves into the dugout. They just threw them onto the field. And I remember that. I'm old enough to remember that, but I remember that very clearly. And when I remember reading years ago, the Yankees, as good as they were having trouble finding one good defensive outfielder to go the other 2 great defenders. And they did come up with a guy named Nick Etten, who could hit like hell and couldn't field for beans. And I remember one of the stories that said, on a certain day, a fly ball went into the outfield, and it landed in the glove that Nick Etten had left on the field. and the reporter wrote, that's the best fielding played in his entire life. So it was the other thing, and the thing that I love to read about, and the thing that I witnessed personally that I'll tell you about in a minute, was in 1941, if you it would not be surprising if you went into a hardware store and Aaron Judge sold you a hammer. It would not be surprising if you went into a grocery store and Mookie Betts tried to sell you a pound of hamburger, or ground up your pound of hamburger. The players' salaries were so low. I mean, it's amazing to me. This guy Soto, who just went from the Nationals to the Padres, he turned down 3 different offers because they were too low. They were only $400 million. That's higher than the GSP of most nations. But anyway, my personal story is that growing up in New Bedford, Massachusetts, when I was 14 years old, I looked as old practically as I do now. And I was shaving the whole bit. So I lied about my age and I got a job in a quilted lining place, a place that made quilted lining for Sears Roebuck and in the Sears Roebuck stores. And I worked there all in the winter, right after school and during vacations. And we had a conveyor belt line in which we would pack this stuff and then it would get to the conveyor belt and the postage. And for the first year I worked there, the whole winter, the guy next to me doing that was named Joe Dobson. The summer before, he had won 16 games for the Boston Red Sox. He was making about $14,000 a year. I mean, it was just, so it was a very, very, very different time. The biggest difference of all was at no time since World War I had this whole thing been played off as against the background of war. All of the research I did, and as those of you who've heard me before know, that's the research I love to do best. All the research I do, you cannot read about anything without reading about Hitler did this, Mussolini did this, the Japanese have now invaded China, the Japanese are now moving in. I mean, you've got 2, 3 nations trying to take over the world, and everybody knows America is high on their list. So it's an extraordinary story. And for the first peacetime in history, as spring training starts, so does the first peacetime draft. And the first Major League Baseball player to get drafted is a guy named Hugh Mulcahy. Actually, his name is Hugh Losing Pitcher Mulcahy. And the reason that he's got that nickname, get this one, in 1938 he loses 20 games. In 1940 he loses 22 games. With that kind of record, you can pitch for the Red Sox. You know. Anyway, he gets drafted, and then, okay, so you have that happening, but then 2 months later, whose number comes up? By a guy named Hank Greenberg. Well, Hank Greenberg ain't no Hugh Mulcahy. Hank Greenberg was the most valuable player in the league the year before. Hank Mulcahy did the most amazing thing in the world the year before. He led the Tigers to be the first team, not the Yankees, to win the American League pennant. And now he's off to war, or he's off to what's called military preparedness. So it's an incredible time, and fortunately for baseball, what it has is one of the greatest arrays of great talent in the history of the game. It's got guys like Jimmy Fox. It got guys like Bob Feller. I mean, I could do a whole talk on him. And it's got 2 of the greatest young players in the history of the game who, by coincidence, come up at the same time. Joe DiMaggio and Ted Williams. Okay? Loved Williams, hated DiMaggio. They were both incredible. And it's in 1941 that they achieved 2 of the things that will never be done again. You got to ask me why, but not now. That will never be done again. 2 of the greatest things ever to happen in any sport. Joe DiMaggio hits in 56 straight games. That's unheard of. That's impossible. Only one player ever hit in more than 56 straight games in organized baseball. Joe DiMaggio when he was in the minor leagues. He hit in 61. He was just and he was not only this incredible hitter, but he was one of the best fielders that ever lived. He broke my heart 7,000 times in Fenway Park. And among everything else, he was one of the best base stealers of all time. He just was that good. And on July 15th, 1941, he gets a hit, as he always does. No one knows that he's going to get 56 more in 56 games. I mean, it's almost impossible. It is impossible. First of all, you never know how an official score is going to rule it. So there were at least 8 times during that streak when no one knew if the streak was over until the official scorer's ruling came down. Was that a hit or an error? If it was an error, then it was not a hit, and the streak was over. Each time, fortunately, was ruled a hit. 15 times he didn't get a hit until his last time up at bat. I mean, it's wild. And he goes all the way. I mean, I could do this whole talk on the streak. He goes all the way until July 17th, when he's by this time, the front page of every newspaper does not start off with war news. Starts off on whether or not DiMaggio got a hit the day before. In the Midwest, you cannot go into a tavern, you cannot go into a coffee shop without the first thing, how'd Joe do? Including in the White House, where Roosevelt asks his aides, before you give me the war news, tell me how DiMaggio did. Finally, it gets to be July 17th, and they're in Cleveland, and like everywhere else, it's sold out because it's Cleveland, it's 60,000 people. And they're waiting for him to get his hit, and the first time up, he hits the ball harder than anybody in that stadium had ever seen a ball hit. And the Cleveland third baseman, Kenny Kentler, dives straight out. On one hop, he gets it, he stands up, and he throws him out. And everybody says, oh, God, thank God it was the first time at bat. The next time he's up, he hits the same kind of ball, and Keltner does the same damn thing and throws him out. The third time he walks, and the fourth time he grounds out. The streak is over. People all over the country are crying. It's over. But it is, and it remains, one of the most extraordinary things that no one's even come close. No one has come anywhere close because it's almost impossible. Today it's more impossible than ever because today no team does not have a pitcher who throws over 100 miles an hour. In those days, every pitcher went 9 innings. In these days, they have 7th inning specialists, 8th inning specialists, left-handers against right-handed specialists. It will be almost impossible. Robert Kramer wrote, the streak went beyond baseball. Everyone was caught up in it. No athlete before or since, not Babe Ruth, or Jack Dempsey, or Bobby Jones, not Jackie Robinson, or Mary Lou Retton, not Muhammad Ali, has ever held the country's fascination day after day, week after week, the way DiMaggio did in 1941. Lou Boudreau, the great manager and shortstop of the Cleveland Indians, put it simply. To me, he said, it was the greatest thing that's ever happened in baseball. There was only one thing that happened, because the minute that streak ended, oh, by the way, when the streak ended, he went back and hit 16 more straight games. I mean, and that only ended because some guy made a miracle catch. I mean, he was amazing. But the thing that was equally amazing was that there was another amazing guy going on, doing another amazing thing. And as soon as his streak went over, the press, the nation's fans, they all turned their attention to a guy in Boston named Ted Williams. He's 23 years old. He's skinny as a rail. He's got 9 different nicknames, the most famous of which will become the Splendid Splinter. He's not a very nice human being. He's not happy to be in Boston. He doesn't like the Boston press. He thinks they're down on him unnecessarily. He would love to be traded, and he spends the first parts of his career begging to be traded. The thing that's interesting, if he played today, he wouldn't have to beg to be traded. His time would come up under the reserves clause, and he could go to the highest bidder, like Bogart's endeavors are going to go. But that's another story. Anyway, in 1941, he is in the middle of 1941, he's hitting 333. That's not enough to even think about 400. But suddenly, today, it's amazing. When I was a kid, I used to read, the first thing, sometimes the only thing I read in the newspaper were the sports pages. And when you read the statistics, the daily statistics, you read the top 10 hitters in the American League. When I went into the minor leagues, I was a second baseman, a much thinner second baseman. When I went into the minor leagues, they told me, you're a second baseman. You don't hit over 310, forget it. I was reading this morning the top 10 averages in the American League. Number 10 is 279. 279, in my day, you might have been sent back. But anyway, he's hitting 333, but then he takes off on a tear. And for the rest of the season, he's hitting way above a 400 average. It's interrupted by the All-Star game. But even in the All-Star game, he goes nuts. The National League had not beaten the American League in like 8 straight years in the All-Star game. They go into the 9th inning with the National League ahead, 5-3. The American League gets men on first and third with only 1 out. Here's a great chance. DiMaggio's coming up, and then Williams. Wow. DiMaggio hits a ground ball right at the shortstop. That should end the game. Should be a double play. He stumbles. He only gets the guy out at second, so Williams can come up. And I'm making this very short and very brief, but Williams hits a 445-foot home run. Not unexpected. That's what he did all season long. It's the most dramatic and the most memorable home run in the history of Major League Baseball. He goes on to bat at the 400 clip, and he comes down to the last day of the season. I'm shortening this whole story of him very much. He comes down to the last day of the season, batting .3955. If you round that off, that's 400. Joe Cronin, his manager. Anybody ever hear of Joe Cronin? Where the hell did he come from? Osterville, Massachusetts. Joe Cronin was the Red Sox manager, and he also became the president of the American League from Osterville. But anyway, Joe Cronin goes to him and says, I'm going to sit you down. The last day was a doubleheader in Philadelphia. He says, you round off 3955, it gets to be 400. You're going to be the first man in years and years and years, and probably the last one ever to hit 400. Williams says, no, I will not back in that way. I'm going to play. So every newspaper, every radio station, everything. He comes up 8 times. He gets 6 hits. He hits the hardest ball, supposedly, that was hit the entire season by anyone, including in those 6 hits. It smashes into the loudspeakers in right field and hits them so hard it knocks them off their holdings, and they spin all the way to second base. He then hits the longest home run he's ever hit. And he winds up with 406. What most people don't know is that, you heard it here first, in those days, the rules were such that if you hit a sacrifice fly, you all know what a sacrifice fly is. Okay. If you hit a sacrifice fly, today if you hit a sacrifice fly, it's not counted as a time at bat. In those days it was counted like an out. If they had counted, if it was today, and they had counted the 21 sacrifice flies he'd have hit 421. I mean, legitimately. It's an extraordinary, extraordinary season. And it gets caught, it gets not only noticed, but celebrated by people you wouldn't think of. For example, at Harvard, their leading psychology teacher, their leading professor, their most famous person is Stephen Jay Gould. What he says about Williams's year is the greatest achievement in 20th century hitting and a lesson to all who value the best in human possibility. Ain't bad for a baseball player. Joe Cronin puts it more simply. Nobody, he stated, could get Ted Williams out. That's more direct, and it's probably the way it was. So it's an incredible, that alone would have made this one of the most incredible years of all time. At the midway point in this season, Williams, who at that time was hitting .405, shared his greatest ambition with the press. He said, "I admit it, I love to hit. One of these years I aim to finish over 400. After all, I'm only 23 now, and I ought to have a lot of chances before I'm done." Little did he know he'd go off 8 years to 2 wars. "I'm looking forward to the All-Star game. Only the best of the best are allowed to play in it. It's an honor to be in that group." Actually, he was wrong. The best of the best were not allowed to play in it. The best of the best were playing in the Negro Leagues. And because God, whoever she was, had determined that they would be black, they were not allowed to play. It's an extraordinary story, and I think of all the research I did in this book, the research I did for the Negro Baseball League and for blacks in baseball is extraordinary. Before the Civil War, blacks were playing in all of the leagues. One, a man named Moses Fleetwood Walker was actually the first black to play in the major leagues, 70, 80 years before Jackie Robinson. He played for a team in Trenton, which in those days was recognized as being in the major leagues. My son and I once this book is out and it starts to sell, we don't want to hurt the sale, but once it's out and it starts to sell, we are going to start a crusade of our own. You know the way that baseball teams and football teams have been pressured to change their names from Indians and Brave and all that. There is a man in the Hall of Fame who was an incredible baseball player in the 1800s. He then became a very successful manager in the 1800s. His name was Cap Anson. And if you go into the Hall of Fame, you'll see a huge plaque, and you'll see his glove, and you'll see the whole description of how incredible ball player. What it doesn't tell you is that he was the biggest racist in the country at that time. And that when he was a manager of one of the most important teams in baseball in the 1870s, if he showed up for a game with his team and the other team had a black player, he would not allow his team to play. And it was costing people money to pull it with all the paying fans in the stands. And finally, what he was doing started to get imitated around baseball. And it's Cap Anson who is really the most directly responsible for the segregation. But segregation did take place. And it's just extraordinary. I've done so much research in that. The players are amazing. I mean, there were so many of them better than anybody in the American or National Leagues. Let me just read this. 3 of the players in particular, Cool Papa Bell, Josh Gibson, and Satchel Paige, attained such a level of excellence that today they are almost unanimously regarded as among the very best black or white who ever played the game. James Thomas Cool Papa Bell may have been the fastest man ever to play the game of baseball. A member of 3 of the greatest Negro League teams in history, he played, as his Hall of Fame plaque explains, 29 summers and 20 winters of professional baseball. Stories about his speed on the base paths are legendary. Let me tell you about Cool Papa Bell, pitcher Satchel Paige exclaimed. One time he hit a line drive right past my ear. I turned around and saw the ball hit his rear end as he slid into second. Tales of how fast he was continue to be told throughout baseball, including those describing how on several occasions he advanced 2 and even 3 bases on a bunt. The most colorful and often repeated story was the one that said Bell was so fast that he could walk into a hotel room at night, turn on the light switch, and be in bed before the room got dark. Black baseball's lack of certified records has, in the case of superstars like Papa Bell, made it difficult to distinguish fact from fantasy, although enough fans and major leaguers saw him play that his greatest accomplishments have been authenticated. The same is true of Josh Gibson. He was a catcher. He was probably the greatest catcher that ever played. And if you ask anybody who really knew about the Negro Leagues, if you say to him, he was the black Babe Ruth, they would say, no, he wasn't. Babe Ruth was the white Josh Gibson. Josh Gibson, what we know is that in his lifetime, he hit over 1,000 home runs. We know that he played in Washington's Griffith Stadium for many years, and while he was there, he hit more home runs than the entire Washington Senators major league team that played in their home games in that park. As much as Gibson was known for the number of home runs he hit, he became equally famous for the extraordinary length of some of the blasts that came off his bat. It is still widely believed today that he hit the longest home runs ever struck in Pittsburgh's Forbes Field, Cincinnati's Crossley Field, and New York's Yankee Stadium. His homer in Yankee Stadium is his most famous round-tripper of them all. No less an authority than the Sporting News credits Gibson with hitting a ball in the house that Ruth built during a National League game, a Negro National League game, that struck just 2 feet from the top of the stadium wall, some 580 feet from home plate. Baseball authorities in the park estimated that if it hadn't hit the top of that wall, if it had just gone 2 feet higher, it would have flown out of the stadium and traveled at least 700 feet. My favorite story of all is the one that has it that during a game in Pittsburgh, he hit a ball so high and so far that no one saw it come down. The next day, when Gibson and the Pittsburgh Crawfords were playing in Philadelphia, a ball suddenly dropped out of the sky and was caught by the startled center fielder. The umpire then pointed to Gibson and shouted, "You're out, yesterday in Pittsburgh." Amazingly, even though Bell and Gibson were legitimately so incredible, they weren't the greatest of all in the Negro National League. That goes to Satchel Paige. I mean, who knows how old he was when he finally, years after Jackie Robinson broke the color barrier, who knows how old he was when the Cleveland Indians brought him up. And he was still striking out the best in the American League. He was not only what he would do when he did this when he was barnstorming, and then he had the nerve to do it when he was in the Negro National League. Sometimes he would call all the outfielders in at the beginning of the game and say, "Sit down, nobody's going to hit the ball that far." And then sometimes he'd call all the fielders in, and he'd strike everybody out. He was outrageous. When they asked him, "What's your secret?" he said, "I use my single windup, my double windup, my triple windup, my hesitation windup, and my no windup. I also use my step and pitch it, my sub armor, my side armor, and my bat dodger. Man's got to do what he's got to do." And he was extraordinary. He just was extraordinary. And who knows? I mean, it's one of the great, what ifs are always sad. And what if these guys could have played? And what if we had records of what they did? Because they were black guys. No one's taking records of this. So it's an incredible story. It's an incredible failing on our part. Baseball is trying each year to do something more to make up for it. I'm doing all right, and I'm Mrs. Ma. Okay, now I'll try to go faster. I like this crowd. I'm going to stay here all day. Do you serve breakfast? Like everything else in 1941, the World Series was unlike anything that had ever happened before, ever. First of all, everybody expected the Yankees to make it, and of course they did, by 17 games. Of course, Joe DiMaggio had a lot to do with that. Nobody expected the Brooklyn Dodgers, and it was an incredible year in the National League. The Dodgers and the Cardinals staged a pennant race, and for the entire season, there was never anything more than wider than 2 games between them. And it was only that the Dodgers won 2 out of 3 of the last series at the end of the season that they made it. The reason that the Dodgers, who had been so bad, made it is because they had the intelligence to go out and get Larry McPhail, a guy named Larry McPhail, to become their general manager. Now, none of us in this room would want Larry McPhail at our house for lunch. He was not a nice guy, but he sure in hell knew how to run a baseball team. He had a lot of things that he contributed to major leagues as well. He was the one who introduced night baseball in Cincinnati into baseball. He was the one who introduced the first baseball game to be broadcast on radio. It was interesting. It was thought by most of the teams, including the Yankees and the Dodgers, that it was a big mistake to have baseball broadcast your game to keep people away. Why would a person come to the game if they could hear it at home? Turned out just the opposite. And in fact, the biggest thing was it just brought out women and kids like crazy. But anyway, that's another story. The Dodgers won the pennant and went from like 33 games out in 1940 to winning the pennant in 1941. Because McPhail staged the most extraordinary series of trades, the most extraordinary series of purchases. He just got rid of everybody on that Brooklyn team and got a whole new team that won the pennant. And then they went in and had an incredible chance to win the World Series. And the Yankees, as was very much expected, won the first game. The Dodgers, instead of lying down as everyone thought they would, won the second game. The third game was key. And the Dodgers won. And then the Yankees come back and win again. So now here comes the biggest game of them all. And with 2 outs in the last of the ninth in Dodger Stadium, the Dodgers are ahead by a run. And the batter is Tommy Henrich, and he's got 2 strikes on him. And Hugh Casey, with the best curveball in baseball, is pitching for the Dodgers, and he throws this great curveball. Henrich swings and misses. The game is over. But wait. The catcher, the Dodger catcher, Mickey Owen, who's one of the best catchers in baseball, drops the ball. It skids all the way back to the runner on third comes in and scores. The game is tied. And as about 4 different reporters wrote, the minute that happened, everybody knew what was going to happen. The Yankees got 6 more runs, and they win that game, and they win the next game very easily. And so they again win. But no, we've got DiMaggio hitting 56 straight games. You got Williams hitting 406, really 421. You've got all this other stuff going on. And now you've got this extraordinary World Series. And what you've also got, as I said when we first got started, you've got the greatest sports writers in the world, greatest writers in the world writing about it. It could only happen in Brooklyn, wrote the sports scribe Red Smith, the immortal sports scribe Red. Nowhere else in this broad, untidy universe, not in Bedlam, not in Babel, nor in the remotest psychopathic ward, only in the ancestral home of the Dodgers could a man win a World Series game by striking out. It's incredible. It's just an incredible story. I know I'm running late, so let me just do the other quite quickly. There is so much I haven't talked about. You have to bring me back. I'll talk about it again. But the thing that I haven't talked about is that with the attack on Pearl Harbor, less than 2 months after the World Series ends, 555 major leaguers go off to war. 2 of them die. Several of them become extraordinary heroes. Bob Feller, the best pitcher in baseball, becomes the greatest Navy gunner and risks his life every day as his ships are shot out from under him. Warren Spahn, who pitched for the Boston Braves and who I saw as a little kid, Warren Spahn becomes a hero of the Battle of the Bulge, one of the great battles of the war. Yogi Berra leads one of the invasion ships on D-Day. I mean, it's an extraordinary, extraordinary story. But there's something even more extraordinary, and what is even more extraordinary, there's only one nation in the world that loved baseball as much as America, maybe even more. And of all nations, it was Japan, the nation that attacked us, that butchered us. And the most amazing thing, again, I'm sorry I don't have enough time, but the amazing thing is that throughout all of World War II, to the end, baseball was played, Major League Baseball was played in America, and baseball was played in Japan. Hundreds of Japanese baseball players died in kamikaze attacks. The best story I read was about the Japanese baseball player, I think he was like the 3rd best pitcher, who was about to get into his plane for a kamikaze attack and said, "Please wait. I don't want to leave until I throw 10 strikes to my catcher." He tried it 3 times, and when he threw his 10 strikes, he got in, flew off, and got killed in his first kamikaze dive. I mean, it's an extraordinary, they're extraordinary stories. When the war was over, the Americans came home. Some of the stories about that could make a whole book. Bob Feller pitched his first game and threw a no-hitter against the Yankees. He'd been away for 5 years. You know, Ted Williams took up again, hitting .385. I mean, when guys are good, they're good, you know. It's just a wonderful story, and it's a, you know, maybe somebody can prove to me that 1941 wasn't the best year, but it doesn't matter. It was a great year, and it's fascinating. And thank you very much. Oh, any questions? Somebody's got to have a question.
When's the book coming out?
You know, I am. If you had asked me that 6 months ago, I'd have said within 2 months. COVID is killing me. It's killing me. None of the publishing houses have all their people in the house. They're all working remotely, and they're all working for such great distances that I'm hoping within the next 6 months. I have to confess, after 67 books and a National Book Award, if it takes a year, I don't care.
So Ty Cobb was still around until like 64. What was he like later in life as a personality, or was he really a jerk? You know?
Oh, he was never a nice guy, but I think he mellowed a little. I've read some stories in which he was playing an old-timers game where he could probably out-hit anybody on the field or the young guys. You know, and he deserved all the acclaim he got, because, boy, was he good. Yeah, we've had some wonderful, wonderful players. We really have. Yes, ma'am.
You said you write books for young adults, or you have. Is this a book that would be, you know, like...
Yeah, what happens is, though, that many of my books, including this one, sell as much for adults as they do for young adults. I don't write down, and some of the best books I've ever read have been others, amazingly, for young adults. Yeah, I mean, you know. Thank you very, very much. My pleasure. Thank you. Always a great audience.